Hello and welcome to Agents of Nonprofit. My name is Alexander Lapa, and I'm here to speak with everyday superheroes helping nonprofits using technology. Joining me today is special guest Ben Duncombe from Australia, one of my longest distance guests so far. And we're here to talk about Salesforce and Salesforce recruiting. Ben, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure, and great to be one of the furthest guests away that you've had so far.
As we talked in the pre-show, I love Australia. I've been there once. I would want to go back. There's so much to explore, and that could be a whole conversation in itself. But I wanted to give people a context that what I like about that is just the idea of remembering that Salesforce is a global phenomenon, right? It's not just a North American or European, which is maybe what most of my audience at least, has exposure to, but it really is a global phenomenon. It can be found pretty much anywhere in the world where there's an internet connection. So just want to share that.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's very evident with the as a recruiter, the amount of people I see coming into Australia from other countries that have built a career in any country really in the world and built up their Salesforce skills, and then have the ability at some point to move to other countries with really Salesforce being that passport to opportunity.
One of the things I do advocate for is the digital nomadic life. I spend half my year in Spain, half my year in Canada. So, the idea and the possibility of having to work remotely from Australia, even if it's part-time or full-time, that's amazing. Just to be able to pick up, from wherever you are and go there or vice versa. It's amazing to be part of the Salesforce ecosystem for one of those very reasons, or that's one of the very reasons why I love being part of the Salesforce ecosystem.
For sure. Yeah, just make sure you pick the right months because people think Australia is sunny all year round. I'm sat here in a woolly jumper. It does get cold in winter. Probably not as cold as you're used to, though.
Yeah, definitely. That's the reason why I escape the Canadian winters, because it gets cold. But because again, I could talk about Australia for quite a while. I love it. But let's talk more about you. And I want to know your background, where you came from. How is it that you are where you are today in terms of your career, of course?
Yeah, sure. So I've been living in Australia for 13 years. I'm actually from London, in Britain. So spent the first 20 odd years of my life in London. Spent maybe 3 or 4 years of that working in recruitment in London, and then got the opportunity to join a company in Australia. So I built up my experience in recruitment and was able to get sponsored for an opportunity to come over and live and work in Australia. And 13 years later, I'm still here. So at that point, my early recruitment career was focused around another technology. So not Salesforce, but SAP. So the first 3 or 4 years in the UK. And then for the first maybe 3 or 4 years also in Australia, I focused on SAP and then found the Salesforce ecosystem and kind of haven't looked back since. So I've been a recruiter for quite some time and specializing in Salesforce for, I think now 7.5, 8 years.
That's awesome. And what was the motivating factor to shift from SAP to Salesforce? Like, was there just an opportunity that presented itself, or was it a natural evolution, some kind of spark?
I think one of the driving factors was that I always had the intention to set up my own business. And the company I was working for, I was very loyal to. I built really great relationships with the directors at the time, and they were very much an SAP recruitment business, and I didn't want to be competing with them. So I was looking at other technologies that were emerging and growing that potentially could be my specialism. And then the other thing with Salesforce was the ability to really understand the platform. I'd spent, like I said, 8-9 years working as an SAP recruiter, more 6 or 7, I think. And I'd never actually seen an SAP screen. To this day, I've never actually seen what SAP looks like to either the user or the consultant building it. And at the time, that wasn't strange to me. It was just kind of how it was. But then when I did some more research around Salesforce and identified there were developer orgs and then Trailhead and things like that. I just was able to connect a lot better with the technology, and I've then since gone on to get certified myself. So back in 2019, I became a certified administrator, which I'd never have been able to do in SAP, and I feel it just gives me greater connection with my clients and candidates because I can understand what they're talking about, what their pain points are, how they're solving problems, what their roadmap actually entails, things like that I would never really have been able to do with SAP.
I think the terminology is a walled garden because previous to Salesforce, I did Siebel, and it was a kind of the same thing where if you're not actively working in it, if you're just recruiting for it, for example, you can't really get into that garden. And it sounds like SAP was the same thing then, whereas you'd you'd find the right people, you could kind of talk the talk, but you wouldn't have really hands-on experience. So it's great that Salesforce allows people to start up a quick org, figure things out, get certified without going through so many bells and whistles and climbing walls to get into these kinds of gardens.
And I think they're like, for want of a better word, this is a word used extensively across the ecosystem, but they are the trailblazers of giving that platform, right? Because now I know only in the last month or so, I've seen SAP have recently released like an equivalent of Trailhead, an online e-learning platform that's free for professionals to go in and study. And I know Microsoft have done the same in the past. So yeah, I think Salesforce were ahead of the times and really kind of drove that in the ecosystem, which has then been followed by other technology businesses.
And in the recent past, and I don't know exactly when you started, but in addition to doing recruitment, you also have a TV show and a podcast. What was the motivation for starting those two sources of entertainment?
Yeah, so the podcast was just an idea we had probably 3 or 4 years ago. It basically stemmed from the fact that I have these day-to-day conversations one-on-one with people that have achieved a lot in their careers, whether they're they've been in Salesforce for a number of years, or they've just transitioned, or just really interesting stories about careers and achievements that I have one-on-one. So I figured that people out there would want to hear these stories and may not necessarily be in a role or be in a position to hear from other people about their journeys in their day-to-day role or life. So yeah, it was just an opportunity to have these conversations on a bigger scale, share some of these great successes, and ultimately inspire others on their journey. And it initially started off as a kind of a face-to-face thing. So we were doing it with really just Australian-based Salesforce professionals or people that were coming from overseas to attend Salesforce events in Australia. We would ask them to be on the show. And then COVID hit, and that really kind of opened up our remit and scope for having these conversations on a global scale. So yeah, it kind of just flowed from there. And now we release a podcast episode every week along with the video in TV format. And then we get to have opportunities to discuss amazing careers with really inspiring people from all across the world, heavily focused on the Salesforce ecosystem and the achievements they've had.
Yeah, there's quite a few episodes in there that I have my eye on as I was scanning, especially all those CTAs, all the certified technical architects, which is a topic actually for later on in the conversation. But before we get there, I'm curious to know, what is it that you enjoy most about finding jobs for people in the Salesforce ecosystem? Like, is there something specific maybe to Salesforce that you didn't notice in the SAP environment, or something sticky, something more motivating, something more rewarding on your side as you're helping to find jobs in Salesforce?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. And I think it does go back to the point around Salesforce making this platform accessible for everyone. Like if I look at my recruitment in the SAP days, the people that were successful and in demand and earning well at the beginning of my SAP journey were the same people at the end of my SAP journey. So it was like, people with 15 years experience that had worked on all of these big implementation projects, and they were still going at the end of that journey. So what I really love about Salesforce is the fact that someone can come into the ecosystem, not necessarily with a huge amount of IT experience even, or, with at that stage, fairly limited experience with Salesforce, and then go on to become really in demand and well paid, people that really, really enjoy the work that they do. So I've seen numerous examples over the years of people that, have really made a name for themselves in the Salesforce ecosystem. And I've never been someone that necessarily sees seniority based purely on years of experience. I think it's what you've achieved in those years. And that's what's really great about the Salesforce ecosystem, is that, someone can just have 2 years of experience, but have done more in those 2 years than someone that's been working with the platform for 8 years in the wrong environment. So it all comes down to the passion and the drive and determination of someone to make a success for themselves in this ecosystem.
I've noticed the same thing, where you have such a variety of people that come into Salesforce. It's not just the IT people, the engineers that go to Salesforce. It's everybody. I've seen musicians, I've seen engineers, I've seen teachers, and each of them can find a place in the system somewhere to help. So yeah, completely agree on the background of people.
Yeah, I'll give you one example that really stands out for me as well. There's a gentleman in Australia who he was a doctor in India. He was a GP. He ran GP practices, and then he emigrated to Australia with his wife, who is a Salesforce professional. And he couldn't get a job in Australia as a doctor because the qualifications he had weren't recognised as for the profession and the kind of roles that he was going for in the medical space.
Right.
He ultimately had to become a delivery driver for Domino's Pizza for a period of time while he was looking for a job, and he couldn't find one. And then his wife encouraged him to learn Trailhead. Long story short, he is now a solution architect working directly for Salesforce, working in the health industry, so helping clients on their health transformation journeys as a Salesforce solution architect.
That's awesome. Yeah, I mean that's such a downgrade day from doctor to delivery.
Well, yeah,
But
but fair play to him for being willing to do that. You know, a lot of people would see that as beneath them, but he was going into medical practices and saying, like, I'll be the receptionist if that's what you want, while I kind of prove myself and get a foot in the door.
yeah, so low barrier to entry, or not, maybe that's not the right wording, but at least an easy doorway into the world is part one. You also mentioned about experience, and I'm curious to know your opinion on that because there's an experience factor which I kind of agree with. It's kind of like, and I would relate it to, I'm Canadian here, downhill skiing. And I've been downhill skiing for like 20 years, but I wouldn't say I'm a very awesome skier. I'm experienced. I know what I'm doing on the slopes, but there are people who have started, maybe 2 years ago who probably are better than I am. So it seems like you've noticed a parallel in that example as well, where there must be some metric to say years experience does count for something. There's the certification element, which we'll get to in a second as well, versus maybe the background experiences that you can transfer into Salesforce. Like what would make someone generally with 2 years experience better than someone who has 10 years experience?
Well, I always use myself as the example in this case whenever this question comes up, because technically I am the Salesforce administrator for Talent Hub, right? We're a very small org. I'm the only person that uses it. But I can hack around and do a bit of configuration. I'm certified. So in theory, on my resume, I could say that for the last 8 years, I've been a Salesforce administrator at Talent Hub. The reality is, I've never built a flow. I've never done really many of the declarative configuration. I guess features or tools I've not really used. I've added fields. I've created pick lists. I've added new things to pick lists, things like that. And for the last 8 years, I could claim to have been an admin. Whereas someone that has worked in an environment that actually is heavy on automation, or has a user base of 500 and lots of integrations, lots of data, a really complex data model, even if they've worked in that environment for 6 months, they would know more than I do, having been a Salesforce admin for Talent Hub for 8 years. So I think it's really about what you've done in that period of time, not how long you've been doing it. And to your point about skiing, like, I've been playing golf for many years and I can hardly hit a ball still, right? It's about the frequency in which you do something. It's about the challenges that you overcome in that time. And yeah, I think that there are people out there that have been doing the same thing over and over in an org that is out of date. They might not have been, it might not be a priority for that business to invest in Salesforce. So like my wife is a salesperson. I often walk past her and I can see she's still using Salesforce Classic. For me, that means that company might not be investing in Salesforce as much as another company that want all the bells and whistles. So it really comes down to what you've done, the environments you've worked in, and what you've achieved in that time for me.
And I guess that translates to exposure, right? If you're an admin for one organization, just doing user registration, for example, then you will not nearly have or not have as nearly much exposure as someone who works maybe at an agency that has dozens of clients with all kinds of automation and flows and Apex and all that, under the deeper technical stuff that is required from that kind of person in that role. That makes sense.
Yeah, 100%.
And then in terms of certifications, and this is always a hot topic on LinkedIn, people talking balance between experience and certifications. In the perspective of the recruiter, how much weight do you put onto certs versus experience? Is there a balance or a threshold that you kind of cross over where at a certain point it doesn't matter how many certs you have or how much experience you have, that the other one counts for more?
I personally will always value experience over certifications. I know, like historically, when I first kind of articulated what I wanted to be built in my Salesforce org, when we did the implementation, we had a multi-select pick list field for certifications, and it got to a point where I just couldn't keep track of what certs people had. You know, there were just too many, and the value of me keeping track of those it just wasn't relevant, because so many people had, 10, 15, 20 certs. And I've worked with candidates in the past that have had certs that they've got no experience in that actual area of the platform. So yeah, for me, it's always about experience. What have you done? What have you achieved? And if you've then achieved something with the platform in that area, then I would say it's worthwhile having the certification as well. It's the I think they've kind of been devalued where there's so many now, and so many people get them before having any practical hands-on experience in a real life environment. And I don't think that was originally what they were planned for. I think it was, let's certify that you've done something, not let's get certified before you've done what you want to do.
And then that's from the person doing the certifications. What about from either the agency or the client that's recruiting for people? Do they have certain restrictions or requirements on how many certs they have and which certs people have? Or is it really find us the right candidate based on the overall profile of which experience counts for more than just certs?
Yeah, I think it depends. I still think I've never seen a company hire someone purely based on certifications, but I have seen companies not hire people because they don't have certifications, if that makes sense. So I'll give you an example. One company I work with, predominantly consulting firms, I find put the most emphasis on certifications. So there's one company I work with, and for a lead consultant, they would expect them to have what they call the big five, which I think are admin, maybe advanced admin, sales, service, and experience cloud. So they would expect their lead consultants to all have 5 certifications as a minimum, based on the kind of work that they do. That's kind of their core offering or core offerings. So yeah, that's why they do that. On the end customer side, so like not-for-profits or companies that use Salesforce and are looking for people internally to manage their org, I find that they have kind of a less of an expectation around certifications. Typically, they would look for someone to have at least one. And I always recommend to people that if you are serious about a career in Salesforce, you should have at least one. And the more senior you are, maybe you should have more than that. But we get the people say sometimes, oh, I haven't had time to do a cert. But if you're working with a platform, you should be able to pass the admin cert, especially if you've been working with the platform for some time. So yeah, I think there is some expectation that you will have certs from both consulting and end user companies. But companies don't hire you just because you have certs. You still need to be able to back that up with experience.
Yeah, and I agree. I've seen the same kind of trends. I'm curious to know, because we mentioned it earlier, the CTA, the Certified Technical Architect, which is the apex of the pillar of the technical world in Salesforce. And you've had quite a few CTAs on your podcast as guests. And I'm curious to know, in your experience and your exposure, is a CTA worth it? I mean, it takes typically, I imagine, a number of years to get there. A lot of mastery across a lot of different domains, technical elements. I mean, there's a lot of prerequisites. I think I'm not even sure how many there are anymore, but at least 14 is the number that comes to my head before you can get your CTA. So is it worth it? Is that journey worth it? Is investing so much of your time and energy to get that CTA, is the benefits of having that CTA worth it, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think I'm in quite a fortunate position to answer this because I have had so many on the podcast, and I think I get to have these discussions around the journey for someone that's gone from wanting to be a CTA to being a CTA, and really I think it is worth it because of the joy that you can sense from that person when they talk about the moment they find out they've passed. But also it is such a sacrifice. Like I was speaking to a lady yesterday that was talking about, she started her CTA journey when she was on maternity leave, and her son is 6 and she just passed the journey. So, that investment of time, and then your whole family, your friends, everyone has to be on that journey with you because you do give up so much through that process. So I think it definitely is worth it, but you need to have a why. Like you need to know why it's important to you. because there's a drain on your social ability to engage with friends. There's a drain on mental health, I'm sure. There's early mornings, late nights. Like it really is a all or nothing. Like you have to be all in and really want it. So yeah, it's well worth it because there are still so few people in the world that have it. And I know from speaking to so many of them that the journey is grueling, difficult, but very rewarding when you finally do get that pass. So I think if you've got the right reasons for doing it and you really can commit and you're willing to commit that time, then 100%. But it's not for everyone, right? It's not like, I don't think you have to have it if you want to be seen as a great architect. I think it opens doors for people, especially with Salesforce partners. It can be something that really differentiates you from other people in the market, and you definitely do get looked to as someone that's achieved a lot and knows a lot. So it does give you that tick in the box for you would be the go-to person in an organization that are using Salesforce or a partner that are implementing Salesforce, because everyone knows it is such an achievement, but you need to know why you're doing it.
So I just double checked. It's actually 10 certs that you need to be able to get the CTA one. So CTA is number 11. And I'm curious to know then, in talking about the balance between experience and certifications, does getting the CTA automatically not nullify, but at least we talked about people who have a lot of certifications but not enough experience to balance that kind of certifications. Do you find that's not true with the CTA? That when you have the CTA, I mean, you've done it. You've made the top of the pyramid. Your experience, whether it's a 1 year, I can't be 1 year, but if it's 3 years versus 10 years, the difference becomes a little less important in that it's more of a bundle of experience and the CTA certification.
Yeah, I would say so. And the reason I say this is because all of the other certifications are theoretical. So they're multiple choice questions that you can retake over and over. I think there's a cap on how many times you can do them, but you can retake them. It's done on your laptop, your screen, and multiple choice questions. Whereas for anyone listening that doesn't know, the CTA is, so yes, there's prerequisites. You have to have achieved those 10 certifications before, but that's only that then enables you to go for the CTA. So it's kind of the starting point then for your journey to CTA. And that's a lengthy process because ultimately there aren't that many review boards available. But the review board consists of you're given a scenario. You have, I think it's 3 hours. Don't quote me on that, but I think it's 3 hours to prepare a solution to that scenario or problem. And then you present that back to a panel of judges, which I think is anywhere between 3 and 5 judges. That could be done face-to-face or over Zoom, depending on availability of judges. And then there's a Q&A at the end of it where they kind of grill you on your solution. They look for holes in your solution and ask questions, and you answer around that. So it's much more thorough than the other certifications. The pass rate is very low in comparison to the other certifications. And having spoken to lots of people, they often don't pass it first time. And it's also very costly in comparison to the other certs. So it's one of those things that, you wouldn't want to be wasting money on. You have to be at the right level to approach it. And there are some requirements that you actually prove that you're at the right level before you go and sit the review board to stop people going for it and not being ready. So yeah, it's a lot more thorough, and you wouldn't pass it unless you have vast experience across the platform. Doesn't necessarily mean a huge amount of years. Like I think there is obviously a limit to how much you can learn in a short space of time, but typically we're seeing that people that have either worked with the platform for quite a long time on big projects, or have worked in other technologies, other architecture roles in big technical transformations, and then move into the Salesforce ecosystem and learn Salesforce and then become CTAs. So it's not something someone would necessarily do with like 1 year Salesforce experience with no background in other technologies. It's really the heavy lifting architecture and being a real kind of high level architect with detailed Salesforce knowledge.
And then the most important question that you can answer in terms of recruiting, what about salary? I mean, does the CTA merit or at least offer you a significant increase, a bump up from a typical architect that doesn't have CTA?
Yeah, I get this question a lot. And it's funny because we're actually doing our Salesforce salary survey at the moment. So we're closing that out soon. So I'll have actual data to present around this soon. But my perception is yes, like if you pass the CTA review board, and let's say you're working for a Salesforce partner and during that time you become a CTA, I would be very surprised if they didn't increase your salary. And then if you move between companies, you definitely have several companies to pick from, and definitely a higher salary than if you hadn't achieved that CTA. I think that's very, very much the answer for partners, because for them it's the more certifications they have, the better, and the more CTAs a partner has, the kind of the better they're seen to be in the market, I guess, in terms of the opportunities they may get passed from Salesforce. So I would definitely say that a salary would go up if you pass the CTA. There'll be some outlying numbers that would say some technical architects earn similar money to CTAs already, but I think it really depends on the company you're working for and so on. But yeah, my view is that if someone was to pass the CTA, they'd very likely be in for a pay rise, whether that's staying with their current company or moving to somewhere else.
And I imagine, of course, there's geography changes as well. I mean, someone who works in the US might not make as much or may make more than someone in, well, actually, I don't know. What are the geography? Do you know any geography differences between them, between different countries? Like if we were to pick the top four or three, let's say US, UK, and Australia, I guess the CT is always measured, or any certification, not necessarily, or any Salesforce professional. Let's not necessarily focus too much on the CTA part. But any Salesforce professional, do you find that there's big geographical differences between those three countries?
Whenever I've spoken to anyone in North America about coming to Australia, it always seems to be that the salary is the sticking point, because they tend to earn more in North America, from my experience, than they would achieve in Australia. The UK, I don't think so much. I think it's probably in line. Maybe there might be a slight difference between the salaries when you take into consideration tax and things like that. I think contracting daily rates are higher as well in the US and the UK than Australia, but actual salaries I think Australia and the UK are kind of on par. But I think North American salaries are typically higher, based on the conversations I have. I don't have a huge amount of data around that, because most of the conversations I have are with Australia and New Zealand based professionals, but that's just going off of the conversations I have had with people potentially considering opportunities to move to Australia or New Zealand.
And I'm really really curious now about the results of this survey, because like I'm freelance, for example. I haven't worked for an employee for many, many years. And I'm curious to know, in the US and Canada, the demand, or at least the availability of people like me, are higher, versus I wonder in other countries whether they're just more employees and they only want maybe 90% employees and only 10% consultants, versus some agencies and some companies in the US and Canada permit a higher percentage of contractors, of external contractors. Do you have any kind of notion about that yet? Or is it, we'll wait and see depending on the results of that survey?
Going off of previous years, so when you say freelance, are you a contractor in the sense that you would contract with one company at a time, or are you a freelancer that would manage multiple clients at one time?
The way I would actually say it is I'm a solo practitioner. So I'm an army of one, and I can have multiple clients at the same time.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So we don't actually see that too often here in Australia. Like we typically have the two models or three models of engagement. One is permanent hire. The other is contract, so daily rate contractor, where you would spend 8 hours per day, 5 days per week working for one company as an external contractor. And then the third option is like a fixed term employment, which is like the worst of the bunch, basically, because you earn a permanent salary, so like the equivalent of a salaried engagement, but you have like an end date on your employment. So typically it's like a 12-month fixed term contract where you would earn, let's say, $100,000, but your contract ends in a year's time. So they're the three models. There are people that do run small consulting firms that would have multiple clients at once, but I guess they wouldn't see themselves as contractors. They would see themselves as consulting partners that work with multiple clients. So yeah, if I look back over the last couple of years, the for us as a business, we were doing kind of 50% contract and 50% permanent hires. But this year it's more like 70% permanent, 30% contract. And over the last couple of months, I would say it's more like kind of 80-90% permanent hires, 10% contract. It was really just through those COVID years where the market really spiked, and there was so much demand and so few people that people were really able to kind of name their terms, and a lot of people were moving into the contract market. And then obviously you've got consulting companies that are seen as external providers where they might do some staff augmentation and place individuals as contractors as well. But if I'm helping a client to hire, it would typically be one of those permanent contract or fixed term.
Okay, that's good to know. I didn't know that there was such a difference, which is interesting. What about from the perspective of clients? Do you have a sense of the needs of a client depend or differs depending on the country that they're in? Would a Salesforce is Salesforce, of course, but is like Sales Cloud less interesting or less popular in certain parts of the world, or by industry, maybe any other kind of differentiating factor of the needs of a client in looking for Salesforce people in various parts of the world?
I haven't seen particular trends around technology or clouds. I do know that environments seem to be a lot bigger in America than we have here. Like we have some very big customers, the big telecoms, the big banks, things like that, where you've got thousands of users, but they're the outliers, I would say. Like the average user base is going to be a lot smaller here in Australia than you get in the US and also the UK. I think in the UK you have like multi-country rollouts. So you would have companies doing implementations in the UK, but then also rolling out to countries in Europe and Asia and so on. And in Australia, we tend to see companies rolling out to Australian users and some New Zealand, and you'll get the odd one that does a bit of Asia, but yeah, on the whole, it tends to be like focused on the country that we're in. And then, we're probably a little bit behind the curve in terms of the adoption of technology here. So we see, like some of the skill sets that are being hired in North America are very much like specialists in cloud. So, you'll get like CPQ consultants, and that's only really starting to take shape here in Australia more recently, in that people will be specialists in clouds. Obviously, like things like marketing cloud, there's always been specialists because they're different. That was off platform, but yeah, ultimately we would typically see here people hiring for a consultant that has experience with Sales Cloud, Service Cloud, and ideally CPQ experience. More recently, it's become that people will look for like a CPQ specialist. As an example, I'm just using CPQ as an example. Obviously, it could be field service lightning, it could be not for profit, it could be anything really. But I know from speaking to people in the US, there's a lot more people that have been specialists in one cloud or product for a long period of time.
Let's talk a bit more about nonprofits. Any sense of differences or the popularity of using Salesforce for nonprofits in Oceania and the UK?
Yeah, I mean, not-for-profits are, we have a lot of not-for-profits using Salesforce in ANZ, some big and lots of small. I think there's always this perception when I speak to candidates that there's some hesitancy to work at not-for-profits because they see the environments as relatively limited in terms of the investment in Salesforce, the breadth of the platform, and things like that. So it can be quite hard to recruit for not-for-profits. I think that perception is often wrong. I think having spoken to lots of people that do specialize in not-for-profit, I understand that the environments can be very complex. The work can be very challenging, but I also know it can be really rewarding to deliver outcomes for these businesses. But yeah, that's often the perception that you're only going to work with the not-for-profit success pack, or you're going to have a limited budget and things like that. But there's lots of opportunity. There's lots of not-for-profits that really struggle to hire Salesforce talent in ANZ. And there are some partners here that just specialize in not-for-profits and really delivering great outcomes for these businesses.
I'm really happy to hear that that it's thriving there too, or at least growing. Because there are a lot of good CRMs out there for nonprofits. Salesforce doesn't necessarily fit the bill for everyone and for every organization, but it is a wonderful package, and especially with that new nonprofit cloud that's come out recently, even more future options going forward. So exciting.
Yeah. And I find that like people that I do speak to tend to either be not for profit, like they want to work in not for profits, or they don't want to work. Like we tend not to have too many people that dip in and out of not for profits. It's either what they're passionate about and what they want to do, or they would prefer to work for like a private sector end customer in banking or something like that.
I get that. I mean, I was sucked in. Actually, one of my first clients was a nonprofit, and the other one was a media company. And then just as time passed, I got just sucked into the nonprofit world because it was just so alluring. So and now that I'm in there, I don't want to leave. So I get that there's a kind of uh, a invisible wall between the two of them in terms of interest levels. It's one or the other tends to be.
Yeah.
I'm curious to know any major or any, because COVID, of course, has been a nice big whack to everybody, but any other trends that you've noticed in the Salesforce career paths for people? Like I know there's a few more certs that have come out recently, and I'm sure there'll be more in the future. But any other general trends and patterns that you've noticed that you'd like to make a comment about from the Salesforce side of things?
Yeah, like we've spoken about the barrier to entry being lower in Salesforce because of things like childhood, but I do really sympathize at the moment with entry level candidates because yes, you can learn Salesforce. Yes, there's the platform there to get hands on. You can have a developer org, you can get certified, but it is still really hard at the moment to find your first entry level Salesforce role. And I think that's something that I would like to see change. I don't know what the answer is. But yeah, right now we're seeing a lot of people that are being lured into the ecosystem, that are getting experience through things like Trailhead, but then really struggling to get a job. And I think a lot of people think the answer is to get experience like volunteering with a not-for-profit. We see that being pushed a lot, but I feel that, it's really important that not-for-profit has some sort of internal expertise that can oversee the work that someone's doing. You shouldn't just give the keys to your kingdom to someone that is just learning, because things can go wrong. So yeah, I'm not sure what the answer is, but that's definitely a trend I'm seeing at the moment where there has been less demand across the board for Salesforce talent, just because we couldn't keep up at those COVID levels of hiring. Obviously the global economy is in a bit of a rocky position, so companies aren't as loose with the purse strings in terms of hiring right now. And the ones that I'm seeing that are being most affected are those entry level people that are struggling to find opportunities.
That's interesting because there was a study done not so long ago, I forget the exact date, that talked about like 9 million jobs being created by 2026. So what you're seeing, I guess, is contrary to that, or at least the entry level people, or maybe there's just so many people that the market's being flooded by them that they're struggling to find and get their hands and experience, get their feet wet. I wouldn't get the exact expression I was hunting for there, but
Yeah,
to get started.
I've seen that study, and I think if you drew, I've not looked at it recently, but I think that like if you drill down into it, I think it's not like those 9 million roles aren't hands-on Salesforce professionals. It's the broader economy. So it's the salespeople, it's customer success, it's the people that are going to benefit from a company implementing Salesforce. And yeah, also I think those facts and figures were released pre things like ChatGPT, which ultimately that could these tools could have an impact on some of the roles in the Salesforce ecosystem as well. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see if they release something that like some more up-to-date stats. But that those studies are one of the reasons that people come into the ecosystem, and that's why I feel we need to do more to help junior people, because they're coming in on the promise of all these jobs, and then they're finding that isn't the reality. There are some great groups out there that like Talent Stacker in the US that help people make their mark in the ecosystem, like help them get experience, help them market themselves and things like that. But there's still a lot of people out there that are just struggling. They're not getting any response from the job adverts they're applying for. People are overlooking their backgrounds prior to Salesforce. So yeah, although those stats are out there, I don't think that's what we're necessarily seeing from a junior hands-on Salesforce professional perspective.
Any advice you can give to those junior Salesforce consultants, people who really want to, maybe who got their first cert but don't really have much experience, maybe they volunteered a little bit, any experience or any advice you can give them to separate themselves from the rest of the pack and hopefully be hired with a good salary?
Yeah, I mean, it's really like, I think the number one thing I would say is to build a network. Like, don't just rely on applying for job boards and jobs you see on job boards, because there's so many people applying for those roles. It's like, who can you build a relationship with that can help you, and you can help at some stage in their careers, and vice versa. But a lot of the people I see that become successful in their first Salesforce job is through networking and having someone in their network point them in the right direction for a job. Maybe that might be recommending them to a job internally at their own company or someone they've worked with before. And then the other thing I always talk about is like, think how many people now are looking for a job and they're just doing trailhead badges and they're just getting Salesforce certifications. Like, what else can you do to market yourself? And whether that's writing a blog about learning what you're learning about Salesforce, whether it's building something in your own developer org that you can showcase in an interview that's different from everyone else. Just ways of being kind of creative that might just make you stand out compared to the other 10 applicants that also don't have any practical Salesforce experience in a live environment and are looking for the same job as you in your location. So yeah, I've seen examples in the past where people have gone away and built something in their own developer org. They've blogged about it. They've kind of showcased that online, and then they've been hired by a company that reached out to them directly. And if they hadn't done that, and if they were just applying for jobs on job boards, they'd have been no different to anyone else.
I would definitely underline that, because I actually had a guest on not so long ago that had some Salesforce experience but wanted to become a developer, but didn't have any actual hands-on developer experience. So he ended up building his own app, and that shot him to the top of the board in terms of I prove by doing it kind of thing. I have experience by doing something. So if you can build your own little app, even if it's just for yourself, even if it's something you can show off in a demo, or you said blog about it, talk about it on LinkedIn and whatnot, that'll show that you actually have some hands-on experiences, which is what I think people are looking for.
Mm-hmm, definitely.
So here's a dangerous question. We both came from backgrounds that was not Salesforce. It was SAP, I was Siebel. And there may be a day where Salesforce isn't the most popular CRM in the market today, whether it's replaced by AI or something else. And I'm curious to know, in terms of also the context of that CTA, where you're going all into into Salesforce, into the ecosystem of Salesforce, like, I advocate for balancing all your experience in Salesforce with soft skills that will be evergreen, like communication skills, negotiation, empathy, these kinds of things. And I'm curious to know, what your perspective is on that. In how much effort should you put towards Salesforce, knowing that there may be a time at some point in the future where Salesforce is not the most popular boy in town, versus those evergreen skills that are more transferable from CRM to CRM, for example?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question, but I'm going to say it depends, which is the typical architect answer, right? But I'm going to say it depends because it really depends on where your skills lie at the moment. Like, if you've got really good communication skills and you can empathize and you can be in front of a user and you can sell a story and all of these things, you probably don't need to invest as much time as someone that is struggling with that. So I think it's really about identifying your gaps as an individual. And right now, if your plan is to have a career in Salesforce, then obviously you need to develop your Salesforce skills. And I think there will be elements of Salesforce that are transferable, whether that's, understanding a data model or even like learning flows. I'm sure there'll be elements of that will be kind of transferable into another technology in the future. But I do feel communication skills are equally as important, in some cases more important than the technology skills. And that's what I'm seeing with customers at the moment. We'll see some customers that have a Salesforce administrator role open for several months because they're struggling to find someone that can really be the advocate of the platform to the business, someone that can really manage stakeholders, build trust with the business. So they're skills that are typically quite difficult to learn, but once you've got them, you won't lose them. So I think, yeah, for me, they're very important skills to have. But if you've already got them, then obviously you need to develop Salesforce skills. And if you don't have either, then I would say they're equally as important to develop for the right now. But long term, you can never lose by really improving your communication, your consulting, and your ability to engage and empathize with the user.
Yeah, I totally agree. You could be the best developer in the world, but if no one knows about you or you're not able to communicate your skills, then unfortunately you're not going to be found as easily, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Ben, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for giving us the global perspective. Where can people find more about you online, either to get to know you as a recruiter or learn about your podcast or your TV show?
Yeah, so I'm pretty much spend my whole life on LinkedIn. LinkedIn's definitely the the best place, and from there I regularly link out to our podcast or website. So yeah, I'm going to say LinkedIn. I actually don't know what my handle is. I'm sure you can put that in the show notes, but it is just B Duncombe. So yeah, just B Duncombe is my name on LinkedIn. So hopefully people can find me there.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining me today.
No, my pleasure. Really good to be invited on, and thanks for the offer.
All right, that's it for today. I'm Alexander Lapa, and I hope you join me again in the next Agents of Nonprofit.